All right, we're here August 4th. We're at the home of Sam and Thelma Dixie. We're with the Reverend Dr. Henry Steele. My name is Paul Ortiz with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. Reverend Steele, thank you so much for sitting down with us today to talk.
Glad to be here. Good
It's
to see you always, Paul.
Thank you.
Seems I just did an interview with you a few months ago at TCC or somewhere at FAMU.
Okay, I think we started an interview, but then you had an incredibly busy schedule, and then you had to go to another engagement, and we just had a really short kind of interaction. But anytime anytime I have the chance to talk with you, I really treasure the time that we have together. There's a lot of information about you, obviously, in media, online, and newspapers, and I found this clip from from a Tallahassee source, and I just want to read it. It's just a couple sentences, if you don't mind. And it says, Reverend Dr. Henry Steele is a testament to a life well lived and shaped by overcoming the challenges of segregation. And I thought that really encapsulated at least a part of what your life has been about. Can you tell us how you have lived this life well lived and how you've struggled to overcome the challenges of segregation?
I heard you and John talking a little while ago around the theme of love. Love, I think, being the greatest force, I believe, on earth, is what has brought me, having been taught and led in that direction. Being able to protest, resist, whatnot, and still love the object of that resistance, I think is what has brought me and so many others like me along the way. Segregation certainly was an obstacle all the time in my younger formative years, and still is, as a matter of fact. But with love, with faith, that faith underlying that love, you can surmount mountains, and I think that's been my case in my life, period, whether it was civil rights or otherwise. Love, I think, is crucial and basic.
What role, Reverend Steele, does community play in love?
Community is more or less the depiction of love, I think. Of course, it depends on what that community is all about, but love is community. Love does not exist without community, I don't believe.
So, Reverend Steele, you gave the address, a talk at the last Tallahassee bus boycott commemoration, and you were talking about how important it was for you as a young man growing up to be in this community where a lot of people were protesting injustice and segregation. Could you talk about what that milieu was like as a young boy growing up and seeing people around you, push back against injustice, and like why that was important for you?
I'm not sure why it was so important, except that I must have just been born with it in my blood. But it was very significant for me, and it made me proud. I was proud of the movement from its beginning on up until now. I think all black people, African Americans, or nearly all, were proud of the struggles and the coming to head of so many different kinds of strifes.
Mm-hmm. Reverend Steele, what made Tallahassee so special in terms both of the movement here, but also like race relations? I mean, what made Tallahassee distinct, if you will?
I'm not absolutely sure about that, but I think Tallahassee's climate, which involved the two universities and a state capital, I think had something to do with the mentality here. Um, you had good leadership among blacks and whites, actually. I think Tallahassee's movement was not the kind that brought about the same kind of hatred, malice, violence as a Birmingham, or as the kind of violence and unsettling that we saw during the Freedom Rides. But we never had any murders and bombings, things like that. I don't know if that's what you're referring to, but I think the movement in Tallahassee has, through the years, been successful. We're where we are today because of the early phases of the movement. Where we are now, good question. And as you all were talking about King's book, where do we go from here? That question is still relevant and makes sense today.
Reverend Steele, can you talk about the impact that your parents had on you growing up in terms of the values that they tried to instill in you, the aspirations they had for you and your siblings?
Most definitely. Our teachings early on were the same teachings that we received during the movement. The same, I remember our parents stressing with us as little children, sharing and love and forgiving and proper behavior as little boys and girls, children.
Mm-hmm.
And that was definitely an impact from the very beginning, from our incipiency as children. It was just the way of life. It was a philosophy of life for us, handed down through our parents.
Did you have aspirations as a child, or as you maybe get into middle school a bit later, about a career, about a occupation? Were you starting to think along those lines?
I think the decisive time was around my junior, senior year in high school. That's when I began preaching, which has been my career. It started in 1961. I was a junior in high school. I don't know if I missed the question or hit it or what.
Oh,
I
yes,
forgot
yeah.
what it was.
Like, I mean, when did you, so from a young age, it sounds like you really had settled on the idea of wanting to become a minister.
Exactly.
Okay. Why?
I'm not exactly sure, except for what wells up in all of us. If that's what I'm interested in, that's what I want to, I'd like to do. And in the ministerial circles, we talk about a calling. And all of us have callings, but we especially talk about the call to the gospel ministry. So I converted that feeling, that deep feeling and unavoidable yearning as a call. And I responded to it. And the teachings of my faith and the teachings of civil rights fighters go right along together.
Mm-hmm. Reverend Steele, can you talk about the training you received, kind of maybe informal but also formal, to become a minister?
So when I finished high school, I already knew I was going into the ministry. I'd already been licensed to preach, and I became ordained my third year in college. And I went on from college to seminary at Colgate Rochester Divinity School in Rochester, New York. And I studied there for the 3-year degree at that time. And other activities, church-related, faith-related, all of those had something to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Were there certain, as you began to read more, like say maybe perhaps in theology, history, religion, were there certain teachers or certain, John Dew talked earlier about authors, philosophers who really inspired him. Were there writers or maybe theologians or others who really inspired you that you thought, wow, this is really powerful?
Right. When I entered seminary, it was the year of the God is dead theology. And one of those exponents was my theology professor at Colgate, Bill Hamilton. That was, of course, quite a thing for me, and starting out.
Now, I don't know, I'm not familiar with that school, though. That you said the God is dead.
Theology. Yeah, it was. You remember that, John?
Oh, I didn't hear the question.
The death of God theology.
Yeah.
Back in the early 60s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was part of my philosophy. Barth, B-A-R-T-H.
I know you were.
I can assure you God is not dead.
Absolutely. They were in fact not saying that he was dead. And I grasped his theology, his thought behind it.
Yeah.
And made straight A in his class. But in college there was L.M. Tobin, Dr. Lucius M. Tobin, who was religion professor at Morehouse. And he had a tremendous impact on me. His depth, yet his simplistic way of implementing the depth of his thoughts and beliefs, his teachings, and his encouragement meant a lot to me. Prior to going to college, we were at Bethel Baptist Church. There were a number of people who were influential, and there was Dr. James Hudson, who was also associated with my dad at Bethel. Mm-hmm. He was college minister at Florida A&M and philosophy instructor, mm-hmm. who had also finished Morehouse and Colgate. So I was influenced greatly by others. My pastor in Atlanta when I was in college, mm-hmm. C.N. Ellis, long deceased now. But it seems I was surrounded by faith-based people. Being in my dad's home, we were encountered all of the time by people coming and going, clergy, non-clergy. So I think in the long run of all the people came through and associated, all of those people had impact. Mm. And I think I knew the life and I could do it. But it's a hell of a bigger job than one would ever think to just be a minister.
Mm-hmm. What kind of impact did, you mentioned being in your father's household, and I mean with groups like like the SCLC, for example, you know, a civil rights organization headed by ministers, what kind of impact did that have on you as a younger kind of minister in training to see all of these ministers involved, not just in the church or even with the congregations, but out doing things, protesting?
Well, one thing it did for sure is all of the people who came from diverse backgrounds and diverse institutions and organizations, such as rabbis coming through, other various denominational leaders and other iconic people. We had them all the time. And I think that was a great environment for all of us because we got a chance to meet so many different people, different ideas, but bound together somehow with some common thread.
Reverend Steele, can you talk about, you know, as you got older, as you matriculated from the seminary, where did you go next in terms of your work and your calling?
I was fortunate, I'm sure I'd say fortunate, just before graduating from seminary, I received a call from Ralph Abernathy. Martin Luther King had been killed a month before. I was getting ready to finish seminary. My dad being King's vice president and having known them all through the years, he learned that I was graduating and he needed someone to help him at his church while he took up the mantle from Martin Luther King. And I was invited to come to Atlanta to be his assistant. That was my first job.
Wow.
So I was thrown right back into the middle of things, so to speak. So I was assistant to Ralph Abernathy at his church, my first job.
Wow. That sounds like scary in some ways. I mean, it's so intense.
It certainly was.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. Because not only was I there involved in the church, but I was back involved, and probably in a bigger way since than previously, but I was right involved in the movement as well as the workings of the church.
What kind of a person was Ralph David Abernathy? In some ways, we don't hear nearly as much about him. He lives in kind of, you know, Dr. King's shadow. But what kind of a person was he?
For one, he was not Martin Luther King for sure by a long shot. He was Ralph Abernathy, and he tried to insist that he was by saying that he may not be able to walk in those big shoes of Martin Luther King, but he had some sandals of his own. So he thought pretty good and well of himself, I think, and yet and still I believe in the shadow of King he had some inhibitions. But he wanted people to really love him. Yet he had something in his personality that somehow would turn a lot of people off, away from him. But he was a very gregarious kind of person, and sometimes a little careless, and who isn't? But he was definitely dedicated to the movement. He had his own idiosyncrasies, but all in all, Ralph was a good man. He was a great supporter and leader in the movement.
Mm-hmm.
Good family man with his children and wife, and good pastor. He's one of the most hands-on pastors to be away so much that I ever saw.
Wow. Reverend Steele, can you describe what you did during those years, like this first big appointment, like what your responsibilities were, kind of?
My responsibilities at the church were very much the same as any senior pastor of a church. I had all of that to deal with, the business of preaching, the organizations and so forth.
That's a lot of work to do.
Right,
Right.
right, and right out of school. But I was used to the pastor's work and what's expected of him in the community. Though I went to Atlanta to a big church, a big congregation, and I felt gratified having had that opportunity. But I was right where I think I wanted to be at that time.
Wow. And how many years were you in that capacity or in that position?
I was only working for Abernathy about a year and a half.
Okay.
Actually, the church did not pay for me to hold that office, that position. This position was offered to Ralph, or help was offered to Ralph by the American Baptist Convention, who asked him what they could do for him after Martin Luther King died. What could they do that would best help him? And he told them, provide me with an assistant at my church. And it just so happened I was the one graduating that I guess came in mind.
Wow. What came next after you finished that year and a half?
After that, American Baptists hired me to work for them in their organizing and developing of work in the South. So I, along with a couple of other men, traveled and moved around and worked and organized the Southern churches and institutions that were American Baptist affiliated into a self-supporting organization. It's a huge organization now based up in Maryland.
Wow.
Yeah, faction of American Baptists.
About how many members are there of that? Seems
American Baptists?
Yes, sir.
You know, I don't know now.
It's a very large organization.
Oh yeah, it's the counterpart, if you say counterpart, to Southern Baptists. Many years ago, the North and South separated and became Southern Baptists and Northern Baptists. Northern Baptists, through the years, changed its name to American Baptist. So it's your prominent denomination among Baptists. American Baptists and Southern Baptists, basically white, both integrated now. American Baptist has been integrated for many years, but not on the scale that it is at this time. Many Black Baptists, National Baptists, others dually aligned themselves with American Baptists, and thereby are able to reap the benefits of being a part of American Baptists, as well as contribute.
Reverend Steele, earlier we were talking about oppression and segregation and Christianity. How do you reconcile, and I guess this is maybe more of a philosophical question, I'm sure you've been asked before, but how do you reconcile the existence of these great evils in the world and the existence of God? Because some people would say, well, you know, if there was a God, why would God allow such things to happen? I'm sure many people oppose this question to you. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I don't always try to come to an answer to that, because I can't answer for God. But good and bad happen to everybody, whether we are His people or not. So I don't try to answer it.
Excellent. All right. So Reverend Steele, we were talking about in terms of your career, can you also talk about your family? You know, as you're establishing yourself as a young minister, like what was your family life like? When did you first meet your wife, and what was that like?
I met my first wife actually before I finished school. My junior, well, I was married my middle year in seminary, and was married during that time in Rochester, New York. So when I came to Atlanta, I was already married, and that marriage lasted about 3.5 years. We were newlyweds, and we were going this way and that. My wife was working for Coretta King in her office, and I was at Abernathy, so we were caught up in that whirlwind of activities. No children born to that marriage, and we were divorced. And it was after that divorce that I received a call to my first senior pastorate in Montgomery, Alabama. And after being there a couple of years or so, I was remarried, which marriage didn't last long at all. They happen that way sometimes. But I was mostly a single pastor in Montgomery. Maybe about halfway through the 7.5 years I was there. And I was called from Montgomery to Orlando, Florida. And I guess every church I get another wife. But I was remarried there. And one daughter was born just around the same time my mother died. The same day, was it?
She was born on the 7th. Mama died on the 3rd.
Right. And that marriage dissolved. In fact, when she was conceived, it was already dissolved or dissolving. And now she's in Atlanta. She finished Florida A&M. She went on and earned her master's and now a doctorate. Her mother is retired and up there as well in Atlanta. But much of my pastoral years, I was single. And single now and have been for quite a few years.
How was Orlando? You were in Montgomery for 7 years.
7.5 years.
7.5 years, and then when you moved to Orlando, was it a lot different than being in Alabama?
Absolutely, it was probably more different than most places I've lived. I couldn't feel the same kind of base or solidity among African Americans. As I do here in Tallahassee or did in Montgomery, Atlanta, other places. Yes, it was different, especially in that wise. And then most places I've lived, there was an African American university or college there, and so that also made a difference in the kinds of people that I was most familiar with. You know.
What were race relations like in Orlando when you moved there compared to other cities you'd been in?
Well, I didn't go to Orlando until '78.
Okay.
And they were blasé. It was a southern town, but I think with Disney and all of the other things, it became more of a diverse situation, and people just went on along. There were issues that would crop up in faction of the people might be together on fighting, but there was never any overall kind of feel of movement in Orlando during all my time associated there.
And how long were you working in Orlando, Reverend Steele?
I was there at that time for about 3 years, but I went back there in '92. I stayed there about seven years. And then I worked for Orange County administration for a while before moving back home to Tallahassee in 2006.
When you moved back to Tallahassee, thinking about this intense history that you and your family lived growing up and the experiences you had being a minister in different cities, what was it like coming back to Tallahassee, and what had changed in the intervening years and what had stayed the same?
Well, you have to remember, I wasn't totally isolated from Tallahassee. I was always back and forth all my life. But it has something to do also with where I am in age as to other times, how I guess how I would see things. I'm trying to think of anything specific that I would like to mention. Well, for one thing, my dad is not here. That makes a difference. Not here in body anyway, but in spirit, he's always around. But my father kept this city, African Americans, geared to what was needed and what needed to be done in regards to African Americans, and especially with civil rights. He was an advocate for that everywhere and all the time, and actually, in a way, still is. You can feel the growth from in times previous, but I don't find it as repugnant as sometimes in the past, and as I find many other places. I was glad to come home. I was really glad to come back here.
Just a few more questions that, and I hope you don't mind me asking about your father. And I remember sitting here or next door in the summer of 1994 when I first met Mrs. Laura Dixie and Sam Dixie. And almost the first, when we started talking about civil rights, as you can imagine, the first individual they mentioned was Reverend C.K. Steele. And especially Laura Dixie. And there was something about the way she talked about him as being like always there for people, and I interviewed Mariola Gaines also during that time.
Those two ladies were some of the most ardent followers in the movement since the bus boycott time. Mariola Gaines and Laura Dixie. They even ventured to national SCLC meetings every year and was involved on that scale as well as local. But they were some of the foremost civil rights fighters in the city, and they followed my dad to a T and believed in him.
What explains that kind of relationship? I know it's kind of a movement relationship, but how do you explain that kind of loyalty that exists? Because it doesn't, it's rare, right?
If we had that kind of sense, all over. It's amazing what probably could have happened between now and then. If everybody had that kind of mentality, commitment, and involvement, we move mountains, but we could move some more. Yeah, they were really straight up, and there was many others, but you didn't find many like Laura Dixie, Marola Gaines, Carol Ross. That was the three women. There were a few others, one or two men who were just always there, just always on the scene when needed, or when something happened.
Yes, sir. Reverend Steele, what remains to be done? You know, we talked earlier about Dr. King's Where Do We Go From Here, CAS or community. What are some of the unfinished business, if you will, of the movement?
I think a lot of house cleaning involving crime and murders, homicides, and within our community, we need to focus on that and come together with some resolution as to how to deal with it and how to stop it, curb it at least. Those are the things that are, and also as we're more integrated and diffused in with all of the population, we lose some of our thrust, I believe, perhaps, or our power. We have to have a conscientious effort to fight and block discrimination and unfairness wherever we see it, and not just for us, but for anybody. That's what I believe.
What do you tell when you encounter younger people who are interested in going into the ministry, you know, becoming a pastor? What words of advice do you have for them?
People going into the ministry,
Yes, sir.
make certain of your calling, that is where you feel you should be. Don't just jump into something because it sounds good and glorious, but something that draws your passion, your commitment, your heart, as well as your capabilities.
All right. Well, Reverend Steele, I've taken up a lot of your time. Are there any closing thoughts you have, or any other things you'd like to share?
I don't guess so. I think this is a very important time in American history for not just African Americans to get together and hold together for the benefit of society when it comes to love and community, fellowship, brotherly love, because what the present administration is doing to our country is something that's going to be felt, I believe, for a long time. And we really need to stand up and resist this kind of thing, especially in our government at this time. We don't want to lose ground that we've made. And we made a lot of ground. And it didn't come just with no effort, but with a lot of sacrifice and deliberate efforts. We don't need to lose any ground. And we can if we aren't careful. Especially with this kind of thing, where our president is low rating us at every turn and making shameful and disdainful comments and whatever.
Yes, sir.
So,
Well, Reverend Steele, thank you for sitting down and taking so much out of your day, so much time. It's been an honor to speak with you, and I want to thank you for the interview.
Oh, I could just sit on now. It's gotten so nice. Breeze is nice. Yeah, always glad to share with you, Paul,
Thank you, sir.
and I want to commend you on the continued good work you're doing toward assembling and dealing with our history,
Well, thank you.
the oral tradition.
All right.